So thank you so much for the introduction. I'm Cristina. This is
Fraser.
And we just started our new think tank, Future Fields think tank. And today we're going to talk to you about super infrastructures and what we understand it to be. But first of all, maybe how we came to work together and how we had this awesome idea. So it all started back in Edinburgh, where I'm working as a lecturer in architectural design, and where we had a field trip to the Outer Hebrides. Fraser was one of my students. He was driving the car, one of the cars. And the whole trip revolved around the theme of data centers and the Outer Hebrides, who would have thought. And it was basically a whole inquiry about rethinking scale of things in terms of scale for the architectural context, from the global to the hyper, super local scale of intervention, to then national, I mentioned regional dimensions and so on. And all of this, wait, I have to move this so that you guys, right. And all of this research went on for almost 5 years under the name of Tectonics of the Material. And they were looking at the Outer Hebrides, the Orkney Archipelago, and very specifically at energy infrastructures and information and communication technology and their infrastructures. And the motto that we were operating under was data is the new oil. Because who's familiar with the Outer Hebrides and the Scottish archipelago? No, it is so one of the main industries there is the oil and gas industry, but it's starting to become obsolete, and there's the question of how does data qualify in today's context as the new oil, and how is it relevant for us, very particular as architects and as designers? What does it actually mean for the built environment when we are dealing with data beyond simple computation and digital fabrication? All of the very typical fields. And just for the ones who are not that familiar with Scotland and the context of the archipelago, so here we have North Scotland. To the left-hand side, we have the Outer Hebrides. At the northern tip, there we have the Orkney Archipelago. Once again, zoomed in, Isle of Lewis, Orkney Island, and the Outer Hebrides to the left-hand side. And this is the typical, so on the field trip, this is a typical landscape that you encounter. World War II, former military infrastructures, not vast landscapes, very beautiful, also a few sheep here and there. This type of also archaeological infrastructures. And then punctually, you start seeing the oil and gas infrastructures too. Then, for instance, the Orkney Archipelago, one of the largest oil terminals, the Flotta oil terminal, no, absolutely massive infrastructures there that are soon to become obsolete. And this is, for instance, then the clash when something is going wrong, super infrastructure, oil and gas, reaches the shores of the Hebrides. But then also at the same time, where data comes in a very pragmatic and also immediate way, Microsoft chose the Orkney Archipelago because of its very unique setting of the renewables and its cold location to test out its first underwater data centers, the guy that you can see up here. Right? So this is a moment then when, in a very applied, pragmatic way, old and soon to become obsolete infrastructures need data centers, and Google and Microsoft, right, which are using it as a testing ground. So students along this 4.5 or 5 years were invited to see, well, what can we do about the sort of tension between the old and the new, and what does it mean for an actual built environment to build something to accommodate and to play with data. And there we were looking at a far larger whole context of hyper-consumerism, no? And hyper-consumerism, especially now if we're thinking of COVID-19 and the whole global context that we're in, it relates very much to global hyper-digitalization, no? So hyper-consumerism, hyper-digitalization, we need stuff. We might So it might be that the postmodern age, it might be all post-human cyborgs, and so on if we look at the theory part. But at the end of the day, especially what this crisis is showing us, we are bound to material and physical infrastructures, and we need those physical products even if they're coming through a digital phase, not to arrive somehow physically within our immediate reach. And also another thing that we're looking at with the super infrastructures now, and what is very apparent in today's context, again, also of C19, not transport and mobility. We take it very much for granted, but it's a whole ecology and network of tiny things and chains that just need to work together. So how do I move stuff from A to B, be it humans, be it goods and services, right? And they're both, me and Fraser, we borrowed a bit the term radical technologies from Adam Greenfield. We didn't read his book yet. It's super, super awesome because it talks about things that we might perceive as radical technologies and others not, such as, for instance, the mobile phone, and how it changes the everyday and how it changes your everyday protocols, architectural protocols, and also urban protocols. And this is an absolutely massive quote from René de Graaf, one of the partners of OMA, but I really like it because it points out very clearly, especially in this whole last part, there's this whole hype about architecture and the digital. We're all becoming digital, the smart city, data evaluation, simulation, and so on and so on. But the more we talk about digital in a very, very abstracted way, particularly as architects, it's not the architecture and the spatial sequence we're talking about, the quality of space. We're moving outside of the realm of the direct built environment and getting lost maybe in different types of discourses. So the more we try to understand what digital actually means from its material footprint perspective, what does it mean to, for instance, use your phone and to place an order somewhere, and what type of chains of the network are being activated, they're embedded in the built environment, the more relevant architects stay in the whole discourse around these themes. And as a continuation of tectonics of the immaterial, we were looking at super infrastructures, super cities, super Dutch. Why super Dutch? We didn't make it up. It was actually a book that was published some 20 years ago on Dutch architecture. Super infrastructures, not because of the scale of it, but super cities, also just looking beyond the singular city and the metropolitan region of it, and focusing, for instance, on the very specific case of the Netherlands, where we were looking at the whole area between Amsterdam, Rotterdam, Hague, and Utrecht, all performing as a vast super infrastructure network. For instance, the Netherlands, why it's so relevant for this theme, at least on a European level, it contains some of the most critical infrastructural nodes we have. So the port of Rotterdam, which is the biggest European port, Westlands, the greenhouses, we're going to have a look at. It's the biggest European food producer and the second biggest in the world. And for instance, the Amsterdam Internet Exchange and the whole conglomerate of data centers. Here, for instance, in terms of a super infrastructure, this is the Alsmer flower auction. It's the biggest flower auction in the world. And there may be a high chance that if you're buying flowers in London, in Edinburgh, somewhere around in Germany, that the flowers early in the morning at between, I don't know, 3 and 5 a.m. were auctioned here and then sent to be transported to your to European countries. And here you can see the auction room now also starting to become obsolete. So these are the live auctioneers. More and more stuff being done from the home office already. This is, for instance, also the Netherlands, also Amsterdam. This is a former shipyard, one of the biggest European ones at its time. And what one tends to do now as an architect when these things become obsolete is to simply just say, okay, right, cultural center, artistic center, which is awesome, which is absolutely great. But I guess that me and Fraser with the think tank, we're just trying to see okay, what strategies could one develop in order to tackle infrastructures that are soon going to become obsolete, such as, for instance, the oil and gas industry, and how can they be reactivated, repurposed, reused, rethought for new type of sectors, such as, for instance, information communication technologies. And just to concentrate a bit more on the Netherlands, so just as a geographic orientation, here we would have Rotterdam, here we have The Hague, here in the middle we have Delft, and this whole area here of the Westlands, and this guy here, that's the port. So that just in relation to the overall size of the city. These are the Westlands, one big super infrastructure, and it looks like this at nighttime. So these are greenhouses. They're some of the biggest greenhouses in the world, and the Netherlands is the second largest producer in the world of food after the US. And this is how these greenhouses look inside, right? So they're human exclusion zone, a term that we borrowed from Liam Young, built for plants and to accommodate machines, hyper specialized. And in between this landscape here of the greenhouses, you can see this teeny tiny, I mean, this is Hague, right? Just white, teeny tiny. This relatively small enclaves, which are small towns, right? So people have to live amongst this or embedded in the super infrastructures. And what does it mean when this type of infrastructures, over time, because of hyper consumerism, have to expand, right? And when they are growing, for instance, towards cities or encapsulating cities, how do we react to it as architects, as urban planners, as landscape architects, and what are the strategies then that can be developed and put in place? And just to give you a perspective, what it looks like in between those greenhouses, this is literally the typical family house right in the middle of these greenhouses. And from greenhouses and food production on, looking a bit more back to the theme of the data center, looking a bit more into detail into data centers, terrestrial landscapes, and also the idea of centralized and decentralized, because and what is the relationship between the data center and food production, right? So again, in today's context, when you are placing an order for food, right? Online shopping, whatever. We rarely think of how that signal is traveling and how it is actually connected to a built environment. So there is always the notion or the idea, oh, well, I'm placing an order, whatever, right? It's the cloud, it's air. It doesn't really exist, right? It's just, you don't really think of the material built environment connection that there is. And the moment you are trying to do research and to see, like, okay, what is actually there in terms of built environment that is relevant for me as an architect from the black screen, right? You're seeing, for instance, okay, there's a whole landscape of data centers and internet exchange points out there where your signal is traveling through, right? For instance, another physical dimension of it. So this is the longest fiber cable line in the world, 35,000 or approximately something roughly around 35,000 kilometers. And this is, for instance, here, right, location of renewable energy plants, right, where Google takes its energy from in terms of green energy. So just the whole dimension of that the access to the digital and us being able to unfold within this digital realm. It means that there has to be a data center, there has to be an energy plant, there's a whole infrastructure around it that needs to work and perform. And if we look, for instance, at London, so London has 175 data centers, Amsterdam 108. For instance, for Amsterdam, if you would count just the very big hospitals, it's just 13 hospitals. And also in terms of theaters, obviously depending on their size, but if we just look at footprint-wise, the biggest one, roughly around 20, depending on how you're counting. Both in architecture schools and also in the overall discourse now, who's really concentrating on, okay, design me a data center, just think of a strategy for ICT from an urban perspective, right? We don't really look at it because they seem to be really, oh, right, it's a singular thing somewhere, why would we really care or engage with it, where it might actually make sense to do so. Just a tiny also disclaimer why there's here a Laura Ipsum text. It's not random, it's because it's an abstract of a book we're working on, so this is just a placeholder, I just noticed, so yeah. Right, and for instance, if we think of the data center, so it's not the fetishized super nice box, right, that we think of as architects. This is the Equinix one in Amsterdam. They were nice enough to let us visit it with the students. This is what the big data centers look like, right? So it's on a completely different scale. They might be outside of the city, but quite often relatively close to it, actually. And it's not about being a moralist or saying like, oh, okay, right, they don't look nice, we need to hide them, right? But it's quite on the contrary, say, well, they're critical infrastructure, especially in today's time. How can we as architects, without being IT engineers or just like, right, any type of engineer, how can we engage with them and make them part of our urban thinking, of our thinking of landscape and of territory, and to have a discussion about how much energy they consume, how heat recovery can be done, and so on. Because at the end of the day, they are huge boxes built to perform and built for a machine to work super smoothly inside 24/7. So it's not about rethinking or offering solutions, right, for what is happening inside of the data hall, for instance, but it's really to just zoom out and think of it, as I mentioned before, from an urban dimension, the landscape dimension, the territorial dimension, right, and also from as an energy landscape for the city. So for instance, here I'm not going to go into detail into the different components and parts, for instance, that students had to look at. And it's also quite interesting in our research to put this type of things in relation to what is happening in art, in architecture. There tends to be this techno-fetishistic point of or way of analyzing and looking at things like, oh, okay, that's the data center, that's the data farm, that's, I don't know, manufacturing something, right, completely decoupled, or often in discourse decoupled from things that are happening in architecture and in the arts, and just doing this type of graphics, see, well, what relations are there and how can they be further explored in work, for instance. And just because I'm aware of time, because I love talking, right? So and as another type of super infrastructure that we looked at, from the ones of just agriculture and food to data centers, right, to then factories and warehouses, and again the idea of centralized, decentralized, and logistical landscape. So this is, for instance, a cover of the New Yorker, where this is how, like, automation, robots are taking over, the human is becoming obsolete. The crisis we're facing, a lot of discussion about what is happening in terms of loss of jobs, and the whole situation discourse. Normally there's always a precedent to it, and here we are looking at for instance, the history of the factory. So from Ford, the Ford production line up, and the building typology of the factory built to accommodate here people working with machines, so rather processes anchored around the human, to today now the factories built around the industrial robot arm, the KUKA, BMW and Audi, where we have this false understanding of, okay, it's all hyper digital, hyper automated, and so on. But then come C19, and we're talking about face masks, and one is looking at, okay, what in terms of textile manufacturing, what are there the conditions for it, and how does the factory look there? You learn that textile manufacturing, most of it is done only by humans, because it is far more productive from very many different points of view. And whereas you can see here that the BMW or Audi factory, right, they're super smoothly and neatly designed to accommodate the processes of the machine working. You can't really say the same thing about today's, for instance, textile manufacturing factories, and they're being ignored in both discourse and both architectural work. So we're just trying to look at this different dimensions, right, of, okay, super infrastructures for machines, super infrastructures for humans, and also just at this stage raising a lot more questions than necessarily answers, and just trying to have a discussion and debate around it, to then looking from, for instance, textile manufacturing, mass manufacturing, to how automated warehouses are. Warehouses and for instance, right, here we have Amazon, Kiva system, the teeny tiny robots now that move everything around, right, where the question is, right, this type of things, they're being again, there's this techno-fetishistic symptom of, no, there's super nice photography, the spaces inside, they're seductive, it's this industrial digital look, right? A lot of discussion about, oh, okay, right, we're building for machines and so on and so on. But then parts like the textile factory, textile manufacturing, they're not being included into the discourse. And for instance, also if we're looking here at Tesla, and just also sizes and scale of things. So this is the Tesla Gigafactory. Probably most of you have seen this graphic, right, where you can see the footprint of the thing, right, in relation to other well-known structures. So it becomes a whole discussion around not only magnitude, but also really what is the actual physical footprint, and what is its relation to territory. I'm moving towards the end of my part. And you're just back a bit to the port, you know, because everything that we order today, it has to be shipped through something. So this is the port of Rotterdam, biggest European, industrial European port. This is the city of Rotterdam, and really this whole thing, this is just machine landscape industrial area. And here, if we zoom in a bit, so here in red, these are the densities. If you can see here, so these are all oil terminals and warehouses, shell factories, whatever. And you have, for instance, again, like in the case of the greenhouses, so the greenhouses in the Westlands we saw before, they're here in this area. I have these tiny capsules of human inclusion zones that need to survive in between the super heavy machine landscapes. And this is how it looks like. So this is a photo taken by one of our students. You have the goose, you have the pony, you have the green meadow, you have the river, and then you have the big industry here, and then you have a tiny cute home there. So what strategies, and it's far from criticizing the port, right? We need those super infrastructures. Again, we see it today, right, how dependent we are on them to function, but what is the urban strategy, and what is the long-term also built environment strategy beyond their just performance and efficiency, where we as architects and urban planners and landscape architects and designers and makers and everyone included, right, can tap in and just try to improve the spatial experience, basically, just as simple as that. And if we look, for instance, into the port, this whole bit, which is the tip, this is reclaimed land from the sea, completely artificial, and the whole thing, the whole port, it's built to accommodate processes that are related to these guys, right, to ships, and to a completely different scale than the human scale. And these are the processes that they are built to accommodate. And this is also the type of energy that they require to work, right? But at the same time, because talking about them just about as machine landscape, that's very deceiving. For instance, the Port Authority of Rotterdam has that many employees, some of them working in transport, some of them working in industry. So it's just the same situation as it is for the factory workers. It might be built for machines and technical processes, but at the end of the day, there are a lot of humans I'm having a moment here. Incorporating and cohabitating those spaces. Sorry, me and Fraser made jokes about it, that this would happen, that I would get a cough, and it's totally happening, right? And then on top of these complexities of the heavy industry, the super infrastructures, you might get then other radical technologies such as drones. And for instance, drones are commonly used now technology for the Port Authority in terms of just monitoring of processes and so on. So what does it mean then if on top of the super infrastructures, we have these radical technologies that just because we need them for performance and efficiency are coming on top of that, and what does it mean for those human inclusion zones? And Fraser, he had a look at that with his research, and they're very specifically developing a scenario and a vision for London in terms of drones. Yep.
So yeah, thanks, Cristina. So I think it's quite interesting that Christina's kind of gone through this overarching idea of everything super, everything massive, all of the waste, all of the products, everything that's kind of going into the way that we live at the moment. It's quite an interesting point now with COVID and so on that, we have a little bit of a chance to kind of talk about that a little bit more and understand where we are, and in terms of, where we go next, what happens there. And I think it's quite interesting, again, that, we have all these radical technologies. Maybe not everyone knows about them just yet, but there's this next question of what does that look like? How does that manifest architecturally? And I think us as designers, we actually have a really key part to play in how you actually start to implement this. And for me, this was kind of my big thing that I kept going back to, going to the London School of Architecture. This was my graduate thesis project. And the interesting thing that I kept going back to about that was in the UK that we recycled more waste in 2013 than we did in 2016, 2017, which is kind of just astounding, because you'd think, as technology is developing and pushing, you'd expect that we should be getting more efficient and better at the way that we're, using these products and then disposing of these products. But actually, that's not the case. It's still kind of on the back foot. And so you've got this kind of thing where, sorry, Cristina, next one. Yeah, you've got this kind of thing where if you look at the way that we deal with waste in the UK at the moment, a lot of it is now starting to be recycled, but we're still not at that tipping point where we're able to kind of tip the scale in the other balance. So a lot of the thesis question was looking at how you actually would implement technologies, in this specific case, infrastructures as well, in a scale, in a way that you could actually, benefit and push us over that scale and change things. Cristina. So, I mean, a beginning of that was starting to think about, how does industry actually live at the moment? How does infrastructure live? And everything we've looked at the moment is very, secluded. So you've got Port of Rotterdam, everything is pushed out to one specific bit of land that is still woven in between where people live. But you also have this thing where a lot of it, the majority of it, is actually being pushed out of the city centre. So this was a very initial design project that was looking at how you would actually bring that back into the centre and how you retain industry and what that means. So the idea is that actually you create a new civic space around these processes. And the idea is that you start to, instead of hide away all these processes to do with waste recycling and how you deal with that, you actually put it on a show for everyone to see, to kind of take an actual kind of count of what is going on and why these things exist. Next. And so it kind of ended up in this rather large scale kind of industrial space on the Old Kent Road in South London. And the idea was that, as the high streets are starting to change, and, especially with COVID, we're now going almost completely online for how we purchase things. What happens to the shop fronts in the high streets, and how do you start to repurpose those and use infrastructure to key into that and kind of create new meaningful ways of interacting with each other? So this kind of turned into, this initial design, which was looking at how you actually collect the waste, and they come into these decentralized ports. And instead of having large scale, huge infrastructures that were spread around the city, or like one just outside of town, you have them spread across the city. So they're kind of dealing with things on the ground at a certain scale, instead of having to be shipped off and transferred different places. Next. And so these were kind of moments where, as architects, you start to have a little bit of a play, and it's kind of whimsical, but you've got this idea that, you know, you can actually start, you know, educating people around where everything's coming from and creating this back and forth between both sides of the coin, between the kind of automated and the human kind of centric side of things. And you can kind of use these large footprints and different ways of kind of utilizing infrastructures to kind of create additional spaces for people as well as the machines. And then this was when I began the journey looking into drones and kind of how they, as a radical technology, are actually going to manifest in our society going forward. So you have this interesting thing where, because they're very efficient, you can coordinate them. Why can't they come and pick up your bin from your door and sort all the waste before it actually enters the facility? And you change the way that these sort of things move. So we've had, you know, lorry drivers for as long as we've known kind of picking up your rubbish from off the street. But what happens when you kind of change that dynamic and you actually start bringing it into drones, and how does that change the landscape? Next. And also looking at, you know, fermentation and different ways of recycling. If you have fermentation tanks breaking down materials, can they actually form new sorts of public spaces and backdrops to allow human activity? Next. And that's just kind of a quick collage that was kind of thinking about that. And next. So yeah, so I mean, the interesting thing at the moment is the top kind of diagram shows how we deal with waste at the moment. So you usually have a variety of different bins that are then picked up by a variety of different trucks, which then go to a variety of different facilities. And all of these are getting it further and further out of the city into larger and larger scales. And none of them really are able to deal with it at source, which I think is a massive issue. And as we kind of showed earlier, a lot of it still ends up in landfill. So the kind of question was, how can we actually utilize these technologies and these infrastructures in a different way? Can we create new infrastructures that allow us to kind of actually consolidate this and bring this back into the city and bring back the activity, because technology allows us to do that. I'm not saying that obviously it's a catch-all thing, but the idea was that then this kind of brought me into the next bit of the thesis, where thinking about it as an upscale thing, if you're actually having to deal with, say, London, in the context of London and the waste that we produce on a daily basis, what is the architecture that actually facilitate dealing with that? So the idea was that, again, you have these separate sort of sorted boxes and things that are picked up by drones and so on. And the idea is that they then take them to a centralized kind of vertical recycling tower that each borough would have. And the idea is that each one of those would deal with all of the waste respective to each respective borough, and then return the actual goods that were then recycled into new things back either to commercial manufacture or back to the houses that they came from. Next. And so it kind of transformed from there, from thinking about, you know, the whole scale question and London, and really trying to get into that, into, you know, what that architecture actually means. Because I think the interesting thing about all of this is that we just don't know what it's going to look like in 30 years' time, which is when we'll need a lot of these large scale infrastructures to deal with the waste that we're doing and the energies we're using and the things that we're buying. So it was kind of a question of how we used to build. So looking back to Hawksmoor and the churches of London and thinking about that, and kind of keying into Stone's Pasticcio and thinking about, if you were going to build, you know, a church at the scale that we build skyscrapers now, what does that look like and what does that manifest? And could you actually build, you know, in stone that high, and so on? And that kind of tongue-in-cheek way kind of led us into what we do right now, which is, you know, it's building super tall is a massive commodity. It's all about the most expensive, smallest floor plate, the highest you can possibly get, and so on. And it becomes a very luxury thing. So the higher you live, the better off you are. And it becomes a very copy-paste architecture. So the idea was to think about radical technologies and infrastructure as, you know, an architecture that actually is more about facilitating all these sort of processes instead of actually kind of giving a very specific language to it. Next. Which kind of led into this slightly disturbing view, where I started to think about the height of things and think about the infrastructure at a very different scale. So taking that very horizontal scale and flipping it on its end, because obviously in London, while it's not super dense, there's a lot of mega cities are going to continue to get denser. So there is a kind of question of floor plate and of efficiency and how you can kind of deal with that. So the idea was designing a building on a 20 by 20 meter floor plate. How can you actually create a recycling facility in that can kind of deal with all of the Borough of Southwark's kind of waste? Next. And so yeah, it kind of ended up manifesting in a super vertical recycling tower. And the idea is that it kind of was built into modules. So the idea being that each one would deal with a different material. and as boroughs change and kind of vary, they would then also be able to kind of change and modify as it went. So if one borough is recycling more than another in a specific type, if they have more metal waste or whatever, you would have more of those kind of functions gone in. And Christina, you can just cycle through these now, so you can kind of see us going down the building. Just to give you an idea. So the idea is that, you know, the drones are picking up your rubbish from out the door, the waste goes in the top, and then it's recycled, and then the kind of the positive byproducts is then come out the bottom. And then you kind of bring in all these other technologies of the data center and so on to kind of coordinate all of this stuff and allow that to actually happen, to then be redistributed back out again. And next. So it ended up kind of translating into this idea that on the far left, you've got all of the functional stuff, and then you've got in the middle the actual structure where all the drones live and sleep, almost like bats. And then you have the architecture at the end, which is kind of the big thing that enables all of that. And next. So the idea being that, you know, today we could be producing this thing very, very quickly, and it's quite a utilitarian way of designing. In a couple of years, you have the full thing built and functioning, and then as time goes on and we get into a more closed loop kind of full circle way of living, you can then start to break that down. And the idea being that almost you only have the relic of what was left of that right at the end. So it becomes this architecture that also recycles itself, which is kind of an interesting thing for us. And then, yeah, just thinking about how that then actually gives something back to the community. So this is a particular site in London Bridge behind Borough Market. And the idea was that instead of turning it into this kind of continuous landscape of pop-up hipster cafes and takeaway sandwich stores, that you actually use the materials as a language to then kind of interpret the way that you kind of live in the landscape. So it actually becomes this kind of odd amalgamation of different materials that kind of form the floor and the ceiling and the walls, and everything is a little bit kind of maybe not dystopic, but there's that kind of different language to it again. And next. And then it becomes this system where you can start kind of having these manifestations of the new infrastructure that enables these things, but they also become social activators as well as you go out through the cities. So you have, you know, you could read something about, you know, you can retrofit the Tate to pick up their rubbish and so on and so forth. So you have these variety of scales that the technologies allow you to actually operate across, instead of just having kind of a tabula rasa, just flattening of everything. Next. And so, yeah, this was just a last kind of thing, thinking about, you know, the next architecture of these recycling structures and infrastructures. And it's kind of a question of, you know, we've built Toll to kind of keep everyone happy, and, you know, everyone can spend their money and show that off. But the next kind of iteration of that was the idea that actually these buildings exist purely because of what we're wasting and how we're wasting it. And the idea was that then these actually become these kind of totemic gestures to, you know, what we're producing, why we're producing it. And the idea being that then you have these linkings across the world and so on, and you kind of have that infrastructural notion. And then next. And that is a little bit of us. So the interesting thing about everything that we've tried to talk about today is that, you know, now we're actually getting the opportunity, I mean, Future Fuels is still quite new, to actually start thinking on a large scale and doing quite a lot of research. So you caught us at quite an interesting time where there's a lot happening, but we can't really talk about everything just yet. And so, yeah, if you can post your questions in the chat, that'd be great. We can start talking about things. But we're kind of at the moment working on some exciting stuff in Rotterdam and looking at, you know, how we actually would implement drone systems in the city and what that means for the port as well, and how you move goods and why you move goods like that and so on. And so, yeah, thank you.
Thanks, guys. If you just unshare your screen, then we can get back to the grid. I mean, I was actually going to ask to start with what you are working on now, but you just said that yeah. You can't reveal that. But yeah, I think it's interesting to see like both of your approaches, like both of your different approaches, and like how they've come together, and like what the kind of form of the practice is, I guess.
Right. I mean, we're really, really fresh. So we're preparing at a couple of, beginning of the year, a submission for a competition, and Fraser was in my office, and we just started talking and saying, okay, let's just do this think tank, because no one else is really looking in a very focused way at the stuff that we are interested in a very arrogant manner. So we're just, okay, we need.
We lost Cristina.
Oh no. Potentially. Oh dear.
Oh no, I think she might have to go and come back. Maybe.
Okay, well, we'll see what she says. I mean, I can handle it from there. I mean, basically, the end to that is that she ambushed me with the idea that we set up a think tank. Oh, here she is. She's back.
Can you hear me?
Sorry, yeah.
Okay. Can you hear us, Cristina? Yeah.
While she's frozen, we have a question from Hai Wu. I'm gonna unmute you, but it's basically just about the representation of the project and like how you put together the drawings.
Right, okay. This is kind of a question I get quite a lot through Instagram and so on. And I think the interesting thing that I always get when I come back to this project is that actually it's all quite eclectic in a little bit of a way. So I'd kind of gone straight through my studies and hadn't taken any breaks. But in terms of the actual putting together the drawings, it's very straightforward in that it's all modeled in Rhino, it's all put into Illustrator and rendered and so on. But I think for me, the thing that I basically was trying to do the whole way through that thesis was trying to think about what an uninhabited architecture is and what that looks like and what the representation is for that. So what wasn't in this presentation is that I did a lot of drawings from the perspective of drones and thinking about their aspect ratio and how they see. So they actually use distance mapping to think about how they move around spaces. So the closer things are, they kind of avoid and they follow particular paths. So a lot of the language kind of came from that. So, and then in terms of the actual kind of the architecture that was shown here, a lot of it is quite utilitarian in the idea that all of it can eventually be recycled and all of it can be very easily assembled and so on. And then it was actually really about thinking about the machinery and how that manifests, sort of that becomes the actual language. So it kind of is partly really, really physical, and then it's also partly quite ethereal in that the facade, the idea was that basically it continually changes as drones kind of hook onto it and come off of it and so on. So you have this quite different language. I don't know if that answers it or not.
We've also got another question from Cameron. If you're happy to, would you like to ask the question directly, Cameron?
Why are you sharing your screen?
Yeah, okay. There's been a lot of reporting about how coronavirus might lead to shortened supply chains and a kind of re-domestication of previously very global industries. Pharmaceutics is one that comes to mind immediately, but there's been some suggestion it could extend to lots of other things. I mean, we already see data being re-domesticated because of GDPR. So what do you think that this means for superinfrastructures? Does it mean that the Tesla factory becomes endlessly split into domestic factories and that the giant one has to disappear? Or is it a super web rather than a super building?
I think I think both things will coexist and have to coexist. I think the super large scale infrastructures, they need to exist just because we're globalized and just because of that's the way in which logistical chains work and also have to perform. And it's useful when they can perform at this mega scale, when we see, for instance, I don't know, just the amount of goods that have to go through Port of Rotterdam so that, I don't know, your stuff reaches actually, the stuff we order reaches our living rooms. But on the other hand, I think that what Corona has taught us is that we do need the decentralized local system also, and it's maybe not about chase the factory out of the city center. It's not anymore the factory that we had from the 18th, 19th century, right? dirty, nasty factory, you don't want it in the city center, right? So why do we still operate under that paradigm? The maker spaces of today, they have nothing in common with I don't know, industrial revolution factories. So I do think that there needs to be a rethinking of the paradigms which are inherited from previous centuries, where it was legitimate to go in a certain way about it, but now just with the new context that we're having in terms of just very simply the machines we're using. Why would a factory need to be outside of the city center for certain type of things, right? Yes, I don't know if that answers the question, but I think both things have to coexist and can coexist.
Maybe these super specialized things like the South Korean microchip factory that makes whatever 70% of all microchips in the world has to remain localized. But pharmaceutics probably best off be made locally. Ventilators too, that'd be nice.
Yeah, no, I mean, I guess like for everyone else, it was just mind blowing to see just the impact that this super infrastructures have once they cannot operate because of humans not being able to operate, because there's also this dimension of techno fetishism. No, it's all machine driven. It's full on automation. It's post human. It can work without the human, and so and it just shows.
Oh shit!
Oh no! Oh.
We're so far away from that. And it's good that we're that far away from that. But yeah, what are then the ways of reacting to it on this local level, right? Where it could still work, right? So even if there's a quarantine or something on a local level, solutions could be found, but it's very hard then to find a solution to bring something, I don't know, 39,000 kilometers across from the end of the world when your hands are tied.
Fraser, do you want to add anything, or I've got another question?
I mean, yeah, I mean, we can definitely jump into the other question. I think it's just quite interesting because I suppose while Christina's like, they definitely will coexist, I kind of have a little bit of a slight kind of question of, I think, you know, potentially we've got to the point where things have got as large as they can get. In terms of Tesla factory, I think that is the most extreme potentially we might ever get, because at the moment they're looking at the state of California and Utah and places where they're building all these massive structures. They are looking to actually, you know, crack down a lot of this because they realize that A, they're losing money, and B, it's not a very good idea for the environment, and so on. But I think there's something interesting, and there might be this middle zone where you still have large scale manufacturing and distribution in certain centers, as Cristina is saying. But I think there is going to be that mid-level to that small scale level, and I think it's going to be really interesting to see how that is utilized and how that is managed, and you know what actually happens with that. But also, you know, and a counterpoint to everything I've just said, you know, it could go the total opposite way, and we just don't know yet, which is kind of, I think, the interesting thing about where Future Fields sits in terms of this research. So
we got a question from Papa. I'm not sure if that's an acronym, or I'm going to unmute you now so you can ask the question.
Do you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Hi, Fraser. I was wondering and asking because your project is kind of the bold extreme of the situation until like this tower that is so big that you have like more space to engage in the background, the floor, no? But I have this question of how do you think in a realistic way we can take a first step in this direction? Because what you're doing is also like, there is, I think, this work with the city and the government, that kind of things. And what would be the first step to engage into this direction of trying the vertical farm?
Yeah, I think that was the thing that I had a lot of questions from old tutors and so on. And I think it's a great question, and because I think that was exactly it. The whole idea of the project was, it was kind of how extreme can you go, to the point where you kind of push it, and it kind of became less about how it physically happens and more about the idea and kind of saying, you know, this exists because of everyone, not, you know, and so on. And I think, you know, I'm actually doing a little bit of work at the moment to look at how it would manifest on a different scale. And I think the simple answer is that it would be smaller. And the idea, instead of having one hyper vertical thing because it was over about 700, you know, it was basically double the height of the shard. It would probably be thinking about, because it was in modules, the idea being that you actually break that down and you utilize a lot of pocket sites and different kind of things like that in the city that aren't necessarily utilized in a meaningful way at the moment. So you start to kind of create a much more decentralized system that can kind of be a lot more agile, instead of, again, kind of having those large kind of vertical infrastructures.
Sure, and it's super interesting, like, to divide it also, because you will kind of create a link between them, and there is like this new communication that can be interesting and not focusing on one point, no?
Yeah. And the idea was that by then not having a lot of this large scale stuff outside of the city, that you kind of free that up, because London has obviously a massive housing problem. The idea being that then you can start kind of utilizing that land for what it actually is needed for, and you can get that uplift, whereas, you know, then you can kind of go and get the really tricky things, and you can fit in those things, because instead of needing all these design guidelines that we have for the way that people live in spaces and houses and so on, which obviously, you know, you either agree with them or not, and as to living in 50 square meters is enough. But idea being that, you know, you can, because a lot of these are machine landscapes, as we say, and they are technology and so on, they don't need to have the same sort of things that we do. So you can kind of shoehorn them into a lot of different ways. And I think that will create a really interesting kind of dynamic between how those things work.
Totally. It's not like Le Corbusier vision of the city where everything is green on the floor. It's kind of, you can really use this space to, like, as you said, do the housing and answer like more typical question we have in the city, no?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's interesting in that, yeah, the modernists have kind of had their day now, so it's kind of what happens next, and how do we imagine that, and how do we deal with that in a real context, I think is going to be the next interesting thing.
Cool, thanks.
We've just got one more question from Will Toos, but he is eating his dinner, so I'm going to read it out for you. He's asking you, both of you, if the research that you've been putting together is kind of looking towards creating a new architectural kind of theory, or you're trying to move away from theory.
Okay, I'm going to start. So I've been working on I know Will, right? Hi, Will. I've been working on this themes now and doing research on them for the last 4.5 years. My point of view on architectural theory is that I don't believe in architectural theory. I think there are personal group manifestos, and I think that there's architectural history. But the concept of theory, and anyways, because it's a wider discussion, but I think super infrastructures for me has nothing to do with theory, or I don't see it the way I look at it. I don't see it as theory at all, because I think it's more a method of analysis and then formulating architectural strategies. So not even manifestos, not styles, not anything of the sort, just strategies. And what does it mean in a very applied way? So for instance, when you look at ports, I'm just choosing the port because, for instance, port of Rotterdam, because it is this huge thing and we all can relate to it, and what it means. How do you go about designing or thinking of a strategy for instance, port development that takes into consideration global trends of technology and so on, but also urban qualities and the way we will curate our everyday in the next 20, 30, 40 years. So for instance, the urban protocols of us, right? What are our urban protocols as, I don't know, young people 2020 compared to the urban protocols, or the way our parents, for instance, were using the city 20, 30, 40 years ago. And they're quite different in terms of, due to the way technology advances. So, I don't know, 20, 30 years ago, to call a cab, you most likely, if you were on the street, now you had to wait for one run after a cab, or enter some establishment and then call for one, right? But now it's just like, I'm on the street, Uber, it's instant, it's immediate. And Uber is also part of a super infrastructure, and it's for me, Uber, for instance, part of the ICT infrastructure, and it's an immediate manifestation and one can relate to it. So me personally, I wouldn't want to see it as theory. I would like to see it as a different way of thinking about design and a method of developing, for instance, briefs and programs and answers of spatial sequences according to this long-term trends, and not just the immediate, okay, I don't know, that's it, I'm reacting to something right now, or questions of style.
And I think it's quite interesting as well, just to kind of an end on that is, you know, we both make things and are working in practice on the ground as well. So, I mean, I'm working in Christina's, you know, making pavilions and printing with concrete and all sorts of things. And I think there is that kind of, from our perspective, that kind of, you know, want and need to make and manifest physically, which you might not necessarily obviously get from theory. And it is that sort of duality that we're trying to kind of capture.
And I'm actually writing right now on a book. So, and it's, I think, maybe to be ready and published in 1 year. And the more I'm writing on it, so it's on the superinfrastructures, the more I'm aware of it, that it has nothing to do with theory. So just also from a very applied point of view, it's really not theory. I hope we'll listen.